Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. I'm Joel. I'm here in Dallas, Texas, here with my buddy Trent over in Denver. How you doing, buddy?
Rocking and rolling, man. I'm feeling good. I got Monday energy. Excited. Ready. Let's roll.
Monday energy. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, but yeah.
Dread, is that accurate?
There's a certain amount of excitement and dread, trepidation, but ready to go-ness as well.
Ready to go-ness. Yeah, let's do this thing.
Yeah.
So our topic for today is how religion fucked up sex. And so we're going to have to put some like asterisks and pound signs in the title. But to start off our conversation, this lead balloon conversation, I want to talk a little bit about the growing up that you and I experienced in I think it's fair to say we both kind of experienced a Protestant, evangelical, slightly fundamentalist sort of upbringing. Maybe not so slight. So growing up, it's interesting. There was far more tolerance for swearing and violence than sexuality. And I'm curious about your perspective and experience of that. Yeah,
I mean, that's something I've thought about quite a bit is, growing up, why is it that, let's say, when we were watching movies, either as a family or when I was just going to watch a movie by myself as a kid, why was it that there was more tolerance for watching violence on television or in movies, to a lesser extent swearing? My family was fairly strict on that, but we could watch violence more readily than depictions of sexuality, however sort of innocuous they might seem to us today. And as an example of that, when I was like 10 or 11 years old, there was a movie that came out called Dances with Wolves. Fairly popular. I think it might have won some awards, but it was directed by and starred Kevin Costner. And there are scenes in that movie. I mean, that was at that point in my life some of the worst violence I think that I had seen.
They people eat a heart in it, right?
Yeah, that might be in Last of the Mohicans or something. But I know.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah,
I'm combining them.
Yes, that's fine. No, I was actually thinking about Last of the Mohicans as well, but. Yeah, somebody gets scalped, I think, in the movie. You see someone get shot up with arrows. There's a substantial amount of violence in that movie. They eat a heart from a buffalo in that movie.
Oh, that's right.
That's what happened after a buffalo hunt. So there's that, but then there's like one sex scene in the movie. I don't think you really even see any nudity. But if I remember correctly, and even if I'm embellishing a little, this happened multiple times growing up, was the only time that I was instructed to like look away was not during the scenes of violence. It was during the love scene.
Yeah.
And
Trent, close your eyes.
Yeah. I'm thinking, why? What is it about our? That's probably true for some other people. Why is it that was the case in my situation? Did you have any moments like that? What was your exposure to movies growing up?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think my folks were a little more liberal, and they weren't as didn't have as much of a tightness about that kind of stuff. I remember seeing movies as a kid that other parents were like scandalized. I remember going and seeing Rambo First Blood Part 2. I think that's what it was called, something weird.
Yeah.
And I think I was like 9 or 10 when we saw it in the theater, and someone else was like, "Oh my gosh, what?" But like sexuality was like next level stuff. It
Yeah.
was like the tolerance level is violence, swearing, sexuality, and I mean, I would hear this stuff preached about regularly as a
Mm.
as a youth. I remember one of the like interim youth pastors had come back from a very well known revival
Mm.
at the time and was like heavy on making sure everything was pure, pure, pure. And we were reading all these books, The Passion for Purity, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. All these books were really popular when I was a
Yeah.
adolescent. And he made this comment about how he repented for watching R-rated movies because basically he knew that watching two people on a screen have sex was no different than watching two real people in his living room have sex right in front of him. And I just remember, even as like a teenager, just going like,
Wow.
I think there's a difference.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just like, okay. Did you ever experience this inconsistency, like growing up later in life as you were like getting into college and stuff? Did you find, what did you do with that inconsistency around these kind of moral grades?
Yeah, I don't think I really have thought about it much until maybe the past 10 or 15 years. I just wasn't really conscious of it. It was
Ah,
something that was so drilled into me. I mean, I started kind of watching when I was a kid. I would kind of watch the movies I wasn't supposed to watch over at friends' houses,
of
and
course.
but I always kind of maintain. I remember even I was probably like 22, 23 years old. I remember watching a movie with friends that had like a fairly explicit sex scene, nothing pornographic, but fairly explicit. And I remember like leaving the room during that scene,
Yep.
but I would never ever dream of leaving the room when I'm watching Saving Private Ryan while people are just
Sure.
being shot up and their intestines falling out.
Yep.
So it's just I think it's a fascinating thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of just the idea and culture around moral codes. And, people obviously talk a lot about the Ten Commandments, and religious people from the Judeo Christian tradition get really up in arms about the importance of Ten Commandments, and they want to like hang it up in courthouses or wherever they
Yeah.
possibly can. And the truth is that like these moral codes are not unique to the Bible. They've been around for a long time. I mean, I remember in high school learning about Hammurabi's code, but there's another code called Namu, and it actually precedes Hammurabi's code by several hundred years,
Yeah.
and it precedes the Ten Commandments like by 600 plus years, and that's if the Ten Commandments are written at the earliest date we think so.
Mm.
And in the Namu code, we see things like if a man commits murder, that man must be killed. That's something we would think about like in
Mm.
these kind of barbaric cultures. But you would also see one that says if a slave marries a free person, a native, he or she is to hand their firstborn over to the owner. And these are like moral codes. Like they must happen, and they seem so baked into the social fabric, the culture of the day. And you and I have talked about this some. Like, what are the pluses and minuses about moral codes from your perspective, Trent?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as much as I'm about ready to like uh, drop kick a lot of the moral codes that we find in like Christianity and other traditions and even in our culture. I mean, I don't think that a society can function without some form of explicit or implicit moral code. So
Sure.
you have things that are written down, inscribed, and you have other things that are just implicit, tacit. They're understood broadly by the culture. We obviously have these, but we have to ask the question of like when are these most appropriate in sort of the development of a person's life. So for example, if you have children who are like 4, 5, 6 years old, they probably need some pretty simple do's and don'ts, right? And as they get older, there more discussion, as a child reaches the age of 10 and beyond, they want to have more discussions about these commandments. I look at it the same way in terms of commandments, let's say from the Old Testament. Or no, let me just, I'm thinking of one from the New Testament. Thou shalt not, or when Jesus says, you've heard it said, you shouldn't commit adultery. But
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, from the book of Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
chapter 5, I think, I tell you, you shouldn't even look lustfully at a woman.
Yeah,
And so
Sermon on the
then,
Mount.
yeah, so it's telling you there's an authority figure, Jesus. There couldn't
Mm-hmm.
be any greater authority figure telling you that you shouldn't do something. Now, one of the responses to that is to just not do the thing and not ask questions. And we're taught as young people that we're not supposed to challenge authority, that we need to follow authority. So if an authority tells you something that you're supposed to do, you do that thing. But that's, to me, one of the minuses of like moral codes and prohibitions is that they have a tendency to shut down healthy discussion rather than
Yeah.
promote healthy discussion. I heard one writer, Adam Phillips, saying, we've phrased certain things as commandments when maybe they should be phrased as suggestions. What happens when something is a suggestion where a culture says, "Hey, listen, let's just take adultery. Hey, there could be consequences of adultery, of committing adultery. So beware of these things."
Yeah.
There's that kind of tone of voice, and there's the other tone of voice that says, just don't do it and don't ask questions about why. To me, a healthy adult way of handling these kinds of situations is to talk about the pros and cons of certain kinds of behavior. And when you have strong prohibitions, they tend to preclude good conversation, good discussion.
Where the conversation has nuance, right? And it invites the why. Why do this? Why not do this? I think those are the important things to kind of transition into, looking back on how religion has fucked up sex.
Mm-hmm.
Just you bringing that up reminds me of, I don't know how many sermons I heard with that particular verse quoted.
Yeah.
But the Sermon on the Mount has so many instances where Jesus uses that little line. You've heard it said, and he usually quotes from Torah. And then, but I tell you, one of them is, talks about anger and compares it to murder. No one thinks that anger is actually murder, but we're fine with thinking lust is committing adultery. So that's what's interesting is I think Jesus was actually like saying, hey, this isn't about an act. This is about a spectrum that has, and all of these, and everything on this spectrum has a certain kind of energy and consequence to it. And there's different severities to them. I think what he was trying to tell the people of his day was like, hey, it's not about not committing adultery and not committing murder. It's actually a deeper call. And that's what I think he was trying to invite people into, but we don't interpret the nuance because we're so black and white. We're so black and white. And so I want to kind of transition, Trent.
Sure, yeah.
I'm going to go back a bit into church history and hear some of your reactions because I'm really interested in how religion has impacted our view of sex, but not just yours and mine, but all of ours. It's kind of like it's in the air. We don't even know we're breathing it. It's the old adage of the two fish swimming in the water, an older fish swimming by them and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they kind of look at him strangely. And when he swims out of earshot, the younger fish looks at the other younger fish and says, "What the hell is water?" It's just like we don't even know. We don't even know what we're breathing most of the time. Yeah. So there are 3 red flags I want to bring up from church history. I've done a lot of church history courses in my day, as I'm sure you have as well. One of them is this idea of concupiscence. Concupiscence, which is usually defined as desire, like heavy desire, often hinged with sex. It could be other things as well, but a lot of the early church fathers, and then going back to Tertullian, specifically St. Augustine, really talk about concupiscence as this almost like an existential, like a teleological like thing that's inside of us that got the original sin of Adam. When sin happened in Adam, that ruined everything. All of our nature is this concupiscence, and it so got tied with sexual like acts. And so there'd be lists of things that are the product of this concupiscence, proving your sin nature: fornication, adultery, bestiality, all these kinds of things that are listed. I'm just curious about how you see the concupiscence play out today.
Well, yeah, I think that, so here's a way that I would frame it, Joel, is we have there are situations in life where people can people can have the same knowledge of a situation. Sort of their knowledge of something is the same, but their value system impinges on that knowledge in such a way as to create disagreements, right? So we can know the same things, but we can have disagreements because we have different value systems. Then there are other situations in life where if people don't have the same knowledge and there's a disagreement because the knowledge is different. So like for in this instance, we find in our experience as human beings that our sexuality can be problematic, right? And so the one of the questions then is what makes it problematic?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say in this instance, the concept, the doctrine of original sin, that there's something fundamentally wrong with us, and that primarily expresses itself through concupiscence, through this sort of unhinged, strong desire. So we have this problem, and it keeps cropping up in our lives through lust and through just can't control our desires, and it's leading me, and it's constantly pulling me in all these directions. So either that's true, or from my understanding, this was revelatory for me a number of years ago, to start doing a deeper dive into how we're wired as human beings. Is it true that we are just tainted as human beings and we have a real problem with our sexuality? Or is it possible that we're wired in a certain way through the long, laborious, tedious processes of evolution has turned us into the kinds of beings that have, for a variety of reasons, a voracious sexual appetite? And even though that doesn't solve the problem, meaning sex is still very complicated, and there's so much going on with it, and it doesn't resolve. We don't resolve it by understanding it better, but we can get rid of some of the shame associated with who we are as human beings. That we're complicated, we're layered, we have all these things, but it's not because we have original sin. It's not because of concupiscence. It's simply that we are human beings with a voracious sexual appetite. So, as a guy, you're attracted to a woman. There are reasons for that. Other than that, you are a sinful creature.
Correct. So, yeah.
That's how I used to see it.
And me too. And I think that's a great point, because acknowledging things is true. I was reading an article prepping for this podcast, and someone quoted G.K. Chesterton where he says, "No one grows a beard out of a fit of passion," and compares it to like Augustine trying to say, and no one gets an erection just because they rationally think it's time to procreate. And so it's trying to explain that there's something going on. But the story of what's going on ends up being this story that pushes over so many dominoes about what we decide it means to be human. And so it leads me to kind of the next red flag. I'm going to fast forward a bit in church history to St. Thomas Aquinas, doctor of the church, wrote that big, huge tomes of Summa Theologica. And he talks about masturbation. And he puts in a list of a bunch of other sexual things, and he kind of creates two camps. There's the camp of natural, like sexual sin, and unnatural sexual sin. The natural sexual sins are the things that that are just like, this is the way our bodies are supposed to work in the natural order, but you do it wrongly, like fornication, having sex with someone you're not married to, even rape. That's natural, but wrong. And then the unnatural would be things like bestiality, masturbation, and basically contraception. The idea is you're using sex in ways that doesn't create another human being. That doesn't procreate. Homosexuality would be put in that category too. So in the way that he even frames it, the unnatural sins are worse than the natural sins. So I'm sure it made sense to them back then, but in our modern eyes, we're like aghast going, Thomas Aquinas believes that masturbation is worse than rape.
Yeah. Well, I mean, masturbation could be construed as genocide. I mean, think of how many potential lives are being just thrust aside.
Even Martin Luther saw it that way. He saw it basically tantamount to abortion.
Yeah. It's just wild. Wild.
Yeah.
And it ignores another reality that we discover. One of the things that I found through research is that a human child is born from 1 in every 1,000 sexual acts as an average in the general human population, right? Which means that we're having an excessive amount of sex related to how much procreation is happening. I mean, to look at it from that standpoint, you begin to realize that sex is not, from my standpoint, is not even primarily for procreation.
Yeah.
It's for pleasure. Obviously, procreation results, but we have so much more sex than is necessary to reproduce. We have sex into our 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond when it's not necessary anymore. So why is that? What's the reason for that? And why tie sexuality to procreation in such a fundamental way when it's not really primarily for that?
What are your views about how this might have impacted adolescent Trent in the messages around masturbation?
Oh my gosh, man. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's not, I don't remember hearing much teaching really about masturbation. I think, I remember hearing certain pastors talk about, when I would ask pastors about, this was in like my 20s, I was asking them about it, but I would ask them about masturbation, and I remember one guy said, well, if you're, the key is lust, so if you're not lusting, then there's no biblical verse, and he's I think right about that. I don't think there's really a scripture in the Bible.
That's a very liberal interpretation too. Like a lot of pastors wouldn't say that.
Wouldn't go there. But he was not willing to say that masturbation was a sin, but he was willing to say that lust was. So he said if you're doing it, you're not lusting. It's just sort of mechanical. There's nothing going on in your head. Then that's fine. But yeah, no. I remember feeling just a general shame about my sexuality, and so I would feel shame about masturbation.
Yep.
And again, it was this constant cyclical thing because I would feel bad about it. I wouldn't want to do it, and then I just could not prevent myself. Just impossible. And so then I would do it, and then I would feel awful, and the downward spiral. Would start the pattern of self-hatred, and ultimately it got to a point where it was just utterly exhausting. It's exhausting to live that way, and then you start asking yourself questions like, is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with what I'm being taught that's producing this kind of environment? Because this doesn't seem sustainable. It wasn't sustainable,
Yeah, it kind of is what's called the addiction cycle, where the shame gets brought up, and the only way to kind of mitigate or remediate the shame is to do the thing that gives you temporary relief from the shame. Yeah. And then it creates this cycle. And one of the most powerful things that ever happened to me is to remove the story of shame. Go like, what if this is not wrong? I'm not calling it right, but I'm calling it not wrong. That all of a sudden changes the dynamic of what's going on. Which kind of leads me to the third red flag from church history, the Puritans, right? So the Puritans kind of get connected to early American kind of when we're first establishing the country, these pilgrims that come over, but there's all kinds of like the Scarlet Letter kind of was a fictional history about the Puritans. The Puritans are kind of painted as this very prudish group of people. If you were to type into Google, which I did recently, the Puritans and sexual repression, that's what I Googled. And then a ton of articles came up defending the Puritans, saying
Mm.
they weren't so bad. They got a bad rap. Whatever. Okay, I'm not trying to like make them all demons or anything. But there
Yeah.
was something very specific in their beliefs in where sexuality belonged in a very small
Mm.
box.
Yeah.
Like it belonged in marriage with this person, and anything outside of that, and apparently they were very, some of them were very free with their sexuality within that box. So that's nice to hear. But like to kind of like they took it to the next level and like here's this box, here's where it belongs, and anyone that does not do it in express sexuality in this box or like lets it bleed out of the box,
Mm-hmm.
there are dire consequences in terms of your community and punishment and
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. I'm just curious when we talk about like kind of a puritanical culture around sexuality, where do you see that at play?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I don't. I think that residue is still very much present in our culture. Like, so you'll hear a lot of people. I've seen this in let's say debates that I've watched between like Christians and non-Christians, where
Hmm.
Christians will really extol the virtues of Christian sexuality and talk. Oh,
Yeah.
Christians are probably having better sex, and we're
Hmm.
all into sex. We're into a very active sexual life and all these kinds of things. So they're quite willing to pronounce how much they're into sexuality, but
Hmm.
then you dig a little bit deeper in terms of certainly sex outside of marriage is completely forbidden. So we're definitely not for it there unless you're a committed married couple. And certainly homosexuality is outside the pale, and so the prohibitions start coming in.
Hmm.
Obviously, lust is a huge problem. So they're definitely for it within certainly narrow parameters.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what the reasons for those parameters um, would um, obviously be biblical, appear to be biblical reasons.
Hmm.
And I would want to open up the discussion with the larger culture and with Christians about why is it that you've confined it to these narrow things. And yeah,
Hmm.
so
Yeah, I get it. And, we're kind of touching on, people who are listening, just the ethics of sexuality. And so, kind of moving forward, Trent, what are some of the voices that have helped you consider new ways to look at sexual expression rather than sexual repression?
well, probably back, I think it was in like 2016 or 2017, I came across a book called Sex at Dawn.
Hmm.
Uh, I think the subtitle is Why We Mate, How We Stray, and What It Means for Modern Sexuality by a guy named Chris Ryan. And I read that book, and it was very enlightening for me. He
Hmm.
goes into sort of our biological evolutionary roots. He talks about human anatomy and what that tells us about our sexuality. He looks at hunter gatherers
Hmm.
from the past as well as the modern day. He looks at our closest primate cousins, chimps and bonobos, to get clues about their sexuality. I mean, it gets very granular. I mean, he talks about what is the significance of penis size,
Hmm.
what is the significance of female copulatory vocalization, like
Oh,
why
wow.
women make a lot of sound, tend to make more sound than men do during sex, usually, as a general rule. What are the reasons for that? All that is in this book, and it's really fascinating. I don't know that everything in there is conclusive, but one of the big takeaways, and Chris Ryan, he has a podcast called Tangentially Speaking that I've listened to for quite a few years now. And one of the things he talks about that he hoped to achieve with the book, he had a lot of people come up to him because in the book, he more or less makes the case that we are not wired to be monogamous as human beings, right?
Mm.
And this is hugely controversial.
Sure.
His belief is that we seem to be wired for what he calls mixed mating strategy, or some people might call promiscuity.
Sure.
So, and I'm not 100% certain where I land on that. I don't. You and I have talked a little bit about essentialism, and is it even appropriate to talk about, to say things like we are essentially this, that, or the other as human beings? But whatever the case may be, one of the things that Chris Ryan is trying to advocate for, he's does not allow himself to be pinned down as advocating for certain relational configurations.
Yeah.
He tells people, like, I'm not here to say that if you choose to be monogamous that that's wrong, or if you choose to be non-monogamous that that's going to be the right path for you. I can't make that decision for you. There's so many other extenuating circumstances that have to be factored in. But one of the things that he does advocate for, I think, is hugely important, is he calls himself a shame exorcist.
Yeah.
That by people learning these things about who we are as and who we might be as human beings, we can at the very least do away with unnecessary causes of shame in our lives and move forward in a inspired and enlightened way to think about how we might organize ourselves as cultures, what might be viable, healthy, life-giving, enjoyable ways of expressing ourselves sexually. That doesn't necessarily have to take one form or another, but to heap shame on other human beings based upon what their sexual desires are, particularly desires that aren't hurting anybody. That is the thing that he's against in this book, and that I took to heart. I felt sort of a burden lifted after reading that book. Like, okay, I'm okay. Like, I have strong sexual desires. These things aren't wrong. They're part of who we grew to be as a species. That's a really good thing. That's a really, really good thing. So, yeah. What about yourself?
I mean, that's very interesting. I just want to kind of respond to your experience there, because I love that phrase, shame exorcist. That's been something the journey I've been on for quite some time, is to try and tease apart guilt and shame, which I kind of borrow some of those definitions from Brene Brown, who's a sociologist, but also some other psychologists, and talk about, generally speaking, a kind of oversimplified way of saying it. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt says, I did something bad. And so there's kind of a psychological experience that's very different when we talk about shame. And I just kind of heard you talking about how, nobody got hurt. And I think that is, it's taken me a while to get to this kind of ethic. I've been hearing talking about it. I've taken so many courses on ethics, but it took me a while to exercise my own shame so that I could hear the message that do no harm truly is kind of the bottom line. And I remember just very confusing messages. I used to be part of a group, a lot of accountability groups and stuff like that, but where there was a priest who told a friend of mine, and he shared this with me, describing masturbation as self-harm, like self-abuse. I think that's what he said. Masturbation is self-abuse. You're abusing yourself. And it's such a story. It's a story that someone made up, that they got from other people. There's no evidence to that being true, other than psychological suffering that we do to ourselves. And so what I've done been trying to do for a long time, is identify where I am the one creating my own suffering. I'm the one that's generating my own negative experience because I'm telling myself a story about myself. And that has cropped up most prominently around my sexuality. And like almost like ingesting these poisonous stories, these codes that help me orient to life as whether or not I'm being good or bad. And the truth is, where good and bad are extraordinarily subjective terms. In fact, I'm personally trying to remove those words from my vocabulary, because good and bad are just extraordinarily subjective. What I prefer to look at is what's harmful and what's helpful. that's a much better, like, more concrete way for me to kind of like to look at things. And when I look at what you're kind of talking about, the shame exorcism, it's just like, you're right. Some people, monogamy is super helpful for them. But I also know some people who are like sticking to a monogamous relationship that they are in, you know, only because of moral obligation, and
Yeah.
they are miserable.
Miserable.
And their life is suffering on suffering, but they're the martyr that's just staying true to the truth. And it's just like, oh my gosh.
Dan Savage. Have I mentioned him? Are you familiar with who that character is? He has a podcast. Yeah,
You've mentioned him.
He has written, I think, multiple books. One that I've read is called American Savage. But Dan, I've seen videos on YouTube of him speaking to audiences, and one of the things that he says, Dan is a relationship advice expert. He is gay, but he's got his start by kind of offering pretty sarcastic and kind of demeaning advice to heterosexual couples. And he was giving them advice and making fun of them and all these kinds of things. He's a really funny guy. But one of the things, he's interesting because people look at him and say, oh, you're super liberal. And he is liberal in a lot of ways. But he also claims to be conservative in the sense that he's for relationships staying together. He wants that. He doesn't say that you shouldn't get divorced, or he doesn't have this crazy view. But he is for sustaining relationships and marriages. And one of the things that he says is, we have made infidelity such a huge, catastrophic, extinction level event that if you are together for 50 years as a couple, and there is each partner has like one infidelity, Dan says, if that's the story of your marriage in an otherwise reasonably fulfilling relationship, and you've had one or two infidelities, you're not bad at monogamy. You're good at monogamy, he says.
Exactly, yeah.
Because it's extreme. Even if you tout it as the ideal, not one single person who has ever had a sexual desire or drive would acknowledge that monogamy is easy. It is not. Dan says you might get married, you might make a commitment to be monogamous. That doesn't mean you're never going to want to fuck other people. You are going to want to. Whether or not you do and how that gets worked out is between you and your partner, but you will not want you will want to do that. And it's better that we all start acknowledging that. And then decide, maybe couples never want to venture out. Maybe there's an allowance for pornography, or maybe they go they do a swinging thing, or there's a seemingly infinite variety of ways that couples can handle that situation. But it has to start with the acknowledgement that, let's be honest about who we are sexually and go down that road together as much as we can. And maybe there will be places where we'll have to set up boundaries, of course. But to not have the discussion and just say monogamy till death do us part, don't ever look at anybody else, that's crazy talk. That is the chalk of children,
Yep. In the interest of just being fair, I would say on the other side of the spectrum, there's a similar kind of wooden thinking that can happen when people are like, well, now I'm free, whatever. And I've seen a lot of people who are like super dogmatic on that side of the spectrum. And they're hurting all kinds of people too with their freedom. And there's a lack of compassion. There's not a real honoring of consent. It's just, and so I want to, that's where I think like do no harm is a really important question. And I love that, because I think relationships are difficult. I'm a divorced man. I had a marriage for 17, 18 years, and it was difficult. It was super difficult. But, I'm proud of, what was accomplished there. And I'm now engaged to be married again. I am for relationships being together. But what I've found in this relationship that I'm in is that there's such a openness of conversation about what's going on inside of me, what's going on inside of her. We get to talk about the way our brains work without like shaming it or allowing either of our insecurities to just take over the whole thing, with a story of like failure, a story of impurity, any of these kinds of stories that we all kind of like lop on top of, what really is just being human.
Yeah. Wow. What a deal. What a deal to be human, man. Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
I want to give you a little theory on my kind of take on sexuality. I like to talk about sexuality outside of that. It's a much bigger bucket than just
Okay.
genitalia rubbing together.
Yep.
It's there's even kind of like what I would call a non-romantic sexuality, like that I might have with other, I'm heterosexual, but like I have my sexualities that play with my male friends, whether we're wrestling together, like hugging, whether we're just kind of like sitting together and just talking over a beer. I find that in all of our relationships, sexuality is at play. It's that kind of like connection that happens. And so I'm curious about what your take on that is.
Dude, you just spurred a thought in me. I think that's really fascinating because I was just listening to a podcast, again, Adam Phillips, I'll make reference to the psychoanalyst. He was talking about how Freud wrote extensively on sexuality, but Freud himself despaired of really being able to clearly define what sexuality was. He's like, we just don't, after all this research, we don't know what it is. So, like, for example, I love what you're saying because it makes me realize, so is sexuality, like, from a guy's perspective, is sexuality putting your penis into a vagina, or if you're a gay man, putting your penis into a butthole? That is sexuality, and then everything before that is sort of not, or a lesser amount. So is giving a hug to a friend not sexual? It's interesting to open that up to what does our sexuality encompass? What does that drive? Like having a good hug with a good friend is a very meaningful moment. And I wouldn't call that sexual, but I wouldn't necessarily call it non-sexual either. I know this seems kind of amorphous and stuff, but I think you do make an interesting point. It does make me think, like, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of things. And we've decided that as a culture that we're going to use sexuality. There might be other cultures, surely there are other cultures that when that don't necessarily use the concept of sexuality. They might have words, let's say, for like, the moment of intercourse, but what is everything else that goes on that's physical contact between human beings, or the meeting of the minds, or all these,
or
I've
emotions?
Even talked, Joel,
yeah.
I've even talked about, like, if I can say something about intimacy here, I've thought of my own sort of version of intimacy is there's dyadic intimacy, which is the intimacy between two people, and we know that there is a certain kind of, or a range of dynamic within that. But then there's also something that I call like polygonal, many-sided intimacy that you might find when you're in a more tribal environment with 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 people. There's that intimacy of the group that's not necessarily two people gazing at each other. It's the group participating in some kind of activity, whether it's a meal or sitting around a fire or telling stories or welcoming home a soldier or people who a family reunion. Like, that's I won't be restricted to using intimacy to talking about two partners having sex together. Intimacy is I have intimacy with my close friends. I have intimacy with you that I wouldn't say is it competes with another kind of intimacy. So I think we've got to really pay attention to how we use words, and maybe open them up or come up with new words even that are better.
Absolutely. And I like to broaden words. Like, I think it's okay to use the word abuse, because everyone, to be human is to experience abuse. Anytime nurturing is absent, abuse is happening. And if we can just kind of like take off the dark like story of abuse, like you're abused. I mean, I've experienced some, I've had some experiences that are, traditionally classified as abuse, but I also know that, like, when someone is just regularly unkind to me, there's kind of a little trauma that happens there.
Right. Yeah.
And I think with sexuality, it's the same. It's like, man, look at people in other cultures who like kiss for their greetings. I think it's a huge marker to see that in our culture we find that to be uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we have tried to put sexuality into this tiny box that it can't fit in. It doesn't fit in.
I remember, if I can cut off for just a second, I remember that one of the silly things that was a rule when I was in high school youth group was, actually it's kind of an unwritten rule, but we were sort of led to believe that when you hugged a woman that you needed to do a side hug so that I guess you wouldn't touch her breast and that she might not feel your dick. And I just was like, I remember there were some people, feel a little poke coming through on you. There were some.
When you're an adolescent, like boners were just like so easy. They're just like, oh, what's that? Whoa, that's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it wasn't difficult for that to happen. So, but then I remember thinking that was stupid, and other people did too. I remember I knew a girl in college who, and this wasn't a thing at ORU where we went to college, but I remember one girl who became a really good friend of mine. Every time we would see each other, she would run up. You probably know who I'm talking about, but I won't say the name.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
She would run up and she would just like thrust herself into me, arms like squeeze the life out of me.
Oh man, and just
no care in the world, and it was great. It was like wonderful. I loved her to death. I thought she was the coolest person in the world, and I just thought that was great. Yeah. And I appreciated her willingness to be like, fuck the conventions. This is the way that I'm going to express my affection for another human being. You know, I appreciated
it's
that.
So beautiful. I love that. All right. Well, we're kind of ending here. I want to give you the last chance to hold the mic here, Trent. Why do you think that this conversation that we've been having about how religion has fucked up sex, why is this a lead balloon? Like, why does it matter to you?
I think because sex has the potential to be so pleasurable, and anything that can be so pleasurable can also be really painful. And I would like to see that in our culture we find more ways of making our sexuality pleasurable and less damaging and need. There's always going to be pain related to it. I think that's ineluctable, but we're doing so much damage to ourselves and to other people simply on account of their sexual desires. And I would like to see, and I think that it hits so close to home that this topic is such a lead balloon, because people are afraid of their own desires. They're afraid of what they've been told. They're afraid of who they might be. They're afraid of, they've been taught, many people, not all people, many people have been taught that their sexuality is dirty. It's wrong. That they want too much sex, and they should tamp it down. And so I want to see more people being told life-giving things. I would like to see, basically, if I could simplify it, I want to see more pleasure and less pain. That would be the desire. And we're not doing that in our culture, not even close. I feel like we've even regressed in recent years. So I think it's a huge topic.
I'm with you. All aboard. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for this conversation of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. I'm Joel, signing off from Dallas. Trent from Denver. Until next time.
Peace.